You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up. The New York Times once said of today's guest that he reads fashion's crystal ball. And while people pick up magazines and scan their websites and social channels for what's relevant and new, it's Greg K that's paid by those magazines to make sure they're on the pulse when it comes to the stars of contemporary culture. While we ask all our guests the namesake question, it's quite literally his job to know what's contemporary now. Whether it's from the Misshapes, the Nightlife, or the masthead across fashion's leading culture titles, you're bound to have heard of our latest guest. Today he tells us the story of his beginning, his benchmarks, and how he's managed to remain so well-versed in the zeitgeist today.
This is Greg Krelenstein, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
Greg K. Well, first off, thanks for coming on the show. We're stoked to have you. And as you may or may not know, having listened to the show, we always start in the beginning. And obviously your beginning to me and so many others was, of course, Misshapes, which, despite the time that's passed in between, still very much is a strong association. But who was Greg K. before the Misshapes?
Greg K. before the Misshapes, I was born in Brooklyn, so from New York. I moved to New Jersey for middle school and had a pretty traditional suburban upbringing. The good thing about being in New Jersey was that I was pretty close to the city, and I made a lot of friends through, the Jewish sleepaway camp circle that my parents forced me into, but later grew very grateful because I made all these friends that lived in New York, and I got to see a couple of other realities, not so different from mine, but a couple of other realities that kind of took me out of the suburban boredom. And I started coming to the city since I was 14 by myself to meet friends. And we would just, shop, go see movies at the Angelica. We never could stay super late, but I would make them go to like some club or something I read about in Interview magazine where all these people that I looked up to were going to. I don't even know how we got into these places because we were literally 15, 16, but I think a different time. His bar mitzvah theme was Greg's Star-Studded Night, and it was filled with just pictures of celebrities. And if you saw my high school bedroom, you would not be surprised about what I ended up doing with my life, because the whole room door was covered with magazine cutouts of various celebrities that I was obsessed with at the time and probably still am.
When you ended up attending NYU for communications and media studies, it was already built in terms of what it was that you were hoping to do. Was it initially working at a magazine in particular? Did you already know that the work you're doing today existed at that time?
I knew that there's some way these celebrities wound up in these magazines that I was reading, but I didn't actually know that there was this job. But one thing I think what I was equally interested in was the behind the scenes people. And I was always more comfortable doing plays when I was younger. And I enjoyed it, but that kind of stopped around 7th grade when I think I became a little shyer. And I did always read about who was the agent behind these people. And I did that from a very early age to know the behind the scenes players. And so I had a little bit of an understanding of that. But I think being in New York, and being at NYU and having the language to communicate what I wanted to do kind of opened those doors.
Do you feel like the actual curriculum was applicable to what you ended up doing? Does it translate?
Weirdly enough, it actually translates, it applies even more now than it did in my early professional career, because a lot of it was actually studying a lot of subcultures and watching movies like Paris is Burning and learning about representation and studying how many queer people were on a show and how many Black people are on a show, how many Asian people are on a show, and seeing how that really affects more of a it took a more psychological, cultural, anthropologist kind of perspective towards media. And also the mediums of the message. I remember this phrase forever. And it was kind of studying how different technological platforms dictate how you see things. So it was definitely not fun pictures fashion, which is interesting because every time I tell people what I do, I say, I have casting, consulting business. People always think, oh, you're seeing runway models. And while I love the world of fashion, it's an amazing world. My passion really was in film and music at first. And then fashion, I would say, is a third. And obviously, since I've worked in it more, I've grown to be more interested and more engaged in that world.
Something that's really impressive about your career path is that if you listen to conversations, be it with Tom Ford or Ethan James Green, obviously in very different contexts, people discuss the idea that the years we are the definitive zeitgeist are sort of relegated to a certain age, right?
I read that.
Yeah. And I think after a certain point, maybe it becomes a more manual process, or perhaps it's relegated to the things you're specifically interested in. But your grasp on culture and essentially the fact that you're paid to know what's contemporary now is impressive and very well maintained. So, what's your relationship to staying up to date? It can't just be about voracious reading.
I think the person that I fortunately stayed the age of was my 16-year-old self, where I really still sometimes feel like that person in the bedroom when I'm looking at my casting decks and I'm putting everything together. I still feel that genuine excitement around this. I always think, I guess, if this feels fresh to me, hopefully it feels fresh to other people as well. So I think it's really just something I've kind of channeled in my inner life that hopefully emanates outwards.
Well, it must because it's still working, right? And you were actually the editorial director at Starworks for 14 years before having opened GKLD with your partner, Lisa Duckworth.
Yeah.
Were there any challenges in that transition, starting something new, or was it kind of a continuation given that the pair of you had already done that together for years at Starworks?
Yeah. So when I started working there, I actually started doing film publicity. I was interning in college, Fox and New Line Cinema at the time. And so I had a little bit of PR knowledge. And when I went to Starworks, what was so interesting about it was basically they worked with all the magazines that I read, whether it was V or Katie Grant was doing pop at the time. And, these were these were niche titles. These were not what celebrities were always doing at the time. So I really feel that experience of also understanding how to sort of operate in the space and how to come up with things that would really work for those kind of titles. I think the same skills applied when we started our company. And just like you mentioned Misshapes and my nightlife sort of era, which is still part of me, and Starworks and, starting my own thing, everything was really organic. And I wish I could say that I had a master plan of we were going to start our own company. But, the truth is things end
Mhm.
and we had some choices. We worked so well together and it was the eve of the pandemic. It was summer of 2019. And I think that really the safest and the thing that I felt most confident in myself was the idea of working for yourself and the idea that like you didn't need these other kind of bigger structures to support what we did. And I think it was the right choice. 5 years going now, it's paid off. What was so great is that in an industry which often you hear about lots of changes, and I've been really fortunate to work with some of these people for 20 years and everyone's been extremely loyal and the business kind of only grew from there. But I was super lucky to sort of have that base that it didn't really feel as jarring as it might have been as if we were going to start something fully new.
Of course. Yeah. And I think with a lot of the examples you're giving in terms of Katie or any of those other magazines that you're working with, or even the brand work you guys are doing, people look at those things and assume that it's the editor in chief or the creative director, the designer, whoever it is that's sort of telling that story. But your role is pretty significant in helping people shape these narratives and how their brand is best represented in the culture today. So, how would you describe that role?
I think that, with all of these titles and all of these brands, we get a brief. We usually have some kind of idea, more the brand work than the magazines. But I think I always look at it as a collaboration. And I think that that's what's excited me about working in this industry, about truly seeing how everything really works together. And I don't ever put myself in, I have my own tastes. And of course, there's very me. There's some people that people will be like, why are you still pushing this person? Why are you trying to get this person on the cover 20 years later? And, there are people that I extremely feel passionate about. But I think for the most part, I really do have a little bit of schizophrenia in that way where I can morph myself into who that person is and who they want and see it. But I think it really is the collaboration. And that's what's the most exciting about doing these things. And when you're actually on set and you're seeing those pictures come to life and you're seeing like this talent. I mean, the exciting thing for me is that a lot of the projects, the focus really is on trying to do something that you've never seen this person like before. And I think that that's always very rewarding, but it is about the collaboration between all the clients.
And does it ever get competitive or territorial given that you do work in the same space and a lot of people want to feel as though they're the first ones to get your freshest ideas, or do they all feel sufficiently different to not have that overlap?
Yeah. Well, in this kind of collapsed world that we live in social media, we are looking at a lot of the same people. And just by nature, there's going to be overlap. And I think that the way that I will get myself out of this question is that at the end of the day, I'm there to sort of put these ideas forward, try to make it happen. But at the end of the day, it is the talent and the teams, and they have bigger strategies than even I have. So it I think that while I could see how someone could be upset if someone chooses one another, weirdly enough, though, all these editors and all these creative directors, they're all different. Sometimes there are names that overlap and everyone wants. And sure, there's names like Zendaya and Rihanna that constantly come up. And of course, no one's going to say no. But,
Mhm.
you'd be surprised actually about how different per season. And I think it's getting more like that, where at least in editorial, to cut through a lot of the mess and a lot of the more mainstream magazines, these magazines are really taking chances and really want to have their own identities. So it isn't as much as that as you think.
So, what is it then that makes a pairing or a good match? Is it just cultural relevance? Is it always tethered to an upcoming project hook? Or I feel like there's something more considered and maybe less first degree, but you tell me.
When we're doing a shoot and we're doing a casting, I'm looking at some of the decks and we're kind of having these discussions. It is the timing. Yes, celebrities typically want to do things when they have something to promote. So to that point, it is about timing in a sense. And I think that timing actually is the most important thing, because it's like you have to have that perfect balance. Because you can't be too ahead where no one knows who they are, because it does fall on deaf ears sometimes. But I think for the right subject and the right team, it is about timing for me, actually.
That's fair, with the exception of those that you're still obsessed with from 20 years ago.
Yeah, the reason I'm obsessed with them is because they still are doing amazing things, and I think this is something that I'm sure that you've seen and observed in the culture about how now we are in this age where some of these more iconic people have sort of come back. I think that what's so interesting about this moment in time is that it isn't really always about the new. Like, it just isn't, because the way that we're absorbing culture and the way that we're seeing things, it's just going so quickly. Even when you asked about the competitor thing, and I said I'd get questions like, oh, if Vanity Fair comes out in April, do you have a problem with following in May? My answer is, the truth is, people have forgotten what happened yesterday at this point. And I think what's so interesting about some of these sort of older, more iconic people coming back is the fact that they were such a part of a monoculture where they were so ingrained in our brains as being these big names. They still feel that way, I think, across the generations, because you'll see slideshows on Instagram of the best looks of Winona Ryder as she's gearing up for kind of a big comeback year. And I think it's not just millennial, it's not just the older generation. I think Gen Z is also looking at this as well and pulling all their references.
That actually contextualizes it in a very helpful way, because it seems like a kind of emerging trend, or in some cases a little bit retro. But to your point, these people are from a time in the culture where actually having traction and deep-seated roots in people's minds in a lasting way was very different than the sort of pace of things today. Which does bring me to another question around the old conversation, when people, of course, were sort of up in arms about the idea that celebrities were newly taking slots from supermodels on magazine covers, which is now decades old. But what are some of those changes today? Or is it just what we're talking about, where it's more so bringing back stronger names and not necessarily always obsessing with the new?
I think to that point, I think if you're constantly chasing the latest, you're going to be behind. And so I think that right now, I'm not saying that I can't be guilty of putting those asks out to all the super relevant people of the moment, because it is who's absorbing the culture and we need to be there. But I do think that there's a bit more considered thought right now, because I think that people are not looking at these as selling newsstand sales. People are building brands, and all these magazines and all these titles are now looking at things more holistically. I feel like the job has changed so much. It's not so much as being just like a bookings, it's almost being like an image director, creating their overall image rather than chasing the trend.
That makes so much sense. And that also makes me wonder, because today it seems as though people still care about there being a print component when you're booking a big talent or a big photographer or whatever. But to your point of these other realms where the imagery not only lives, but is predominantly consumed, do you feel like that informs the decision? I mean, I guess at this point, it's not a new question, but does data matter?
I think that matters more in the advertising than the editorial. I've been thinking actually a lot about this. And this is, when we started our company, I never really thought about the job this way, but I look at myself almost in the same way as a stylist, saying that we're only going to do 3 editorials this season or something like that. They're looking at things in just a different way. And I think what that means is they know that the editorial isn't necessarily the thing that's going to be their financial gain, but it's the thing that's really going to have the most impact in culture. And I think that it still does have the power to do it. We could look at that British Vogue cover. Yes, most people absorbed it online, but I don't know if those people would have come together if it wasn't a print. There were times even at my old company where they were like, hide the magazines. And, if a brand comes in, they're going to think everything is focused on digital. I think, going back to your question about zeitgeist and age, I think I feel lucky to be born on the cusp of kind of understanding both. I can't say I was purely digital. I'm not, but I was kind of on the cusp of having that and having both understandings of the monoculture, but also I think having still a good grasp on what's happening now.
And in terms of what's happening now, you obviously work with very independent and directional clients across both brands and magazines. So I would imagine that their taste is very much in line with your own. But do you ever find yourself in an uphill battle pushing for people against the grain?
I think at this point, we're pretty aligned. I do have a little bit of a sixth sense. I'll see something or I'll see a movie or I'll just see someone like at the Met and I'll be like, okay, this person is just even this, the dress that they wore, this will be who they're going to want. And so there are people that sometimes I'm like, okay, we have to do this, and I definitely push for who I want. But no, I would say for the most part, we're in alignment.
And another thing we've been revisiting a lot this season is the conversation around DEI and whether or not it sustained the progress that it achieved in recent years, or if we're seeing a kind of slip in some of those sectors. What are your thoughts, or how have the requests that you're getting changed?
I guess I can't really speak to the industry as a whole, but in my experience, I have been fortunate enough to work with really forward thinking creatives who are just really interested in always pushing boundaries, always implementing change, and kind of making people uncomfortable sometimes, even by creating images that are impactful and reflect really the world that we truly live in versus things that are based on other social metrics. And I think that goes from in front and behind the camera. And obviously, in the last couple of years, that's been a bigger conversation. But it's obviously something that I'm constantly aware of, and in an industry where I think we should be pushing for things that really reflect the world that we're in. And it is a diverse world. I think in terms of talent, people know at this point, it's not about one person. It's about really reflecting a multitude of personalities.
I remember you actually in that New York Times article that you did 10 years ago now, which is crazy. You had talked about that sort of pivotal moment, which I believe was the Another Magazine project that you had done. Obviously, you've gone on to do a number of very significant projects. I remember you and I actually worked together on Kendall Jenner's first Love cover, which was sort of the onset of that movement that's now very much been normalized. But what other standout moments in your career feel quite pivotal or like benchmarks?
I think I was very appreciative to be a part of kind of renaissance of Calvin Klein with the My Calvins campaign. We worked on a couple seasons with them, and it was very, really, truly much the campaign that I think set the tone for really every kind of marching order that we've worked on since, which is really about going back to your question about having the multi-tiered casting approach, where they knew that it wasn't about just the big A-list celebrity anymore. And we had to hit all points of culture. And what was so genius about that campaign was that it had all levels of casting, from top tier celebrities to real people casting to all genres, athletes, musicians, artists. And it was also one of the first campaigns that I really worked on that understood really digital and understood all the kind of social media means that you really do need to launch a campaign, because it's obviously, and I know this has come up before, but just having a still image doesn't really work anymore. And I think what was so impactful about was the ensemble cast and then the video, all the different video treatments. And I think truly that campaign, which I think the first one we did, the first season was, I think Kendall was in it with Justin Bieber and Kendrick Lamar, FK Twigs, trying to remember. And then, there was a whole lot of other characters in there, Grace Coddington even. And I think the projects that really feel the most impactful, it's not chasing the trend. And it really is coming from a genuine place of wanting to spotlight the people that really matter in culture. I think we've seen that now with the Jacquemus ad with Kristen Davis and Maggie Smith for Loewe. Like the ads that you really kind of remember are really the ones where it feels genuine to the designers in the house. And I think that's what excites me about this industry, that it's not always about the people that are most obvious.
I don't want to sound a little bit too formulaic, but surely there are sort of moments or reoccurring benchmarks, like a particular award being won or whatever it is that one draws from in terms of determining the right timing or what feels really relevant to the culture. What sort of systems do you work with in that capacity?
I would say yes, awards and accolades matter, but I would say less and less. I do think that people are obviously paying attention, and there's nothing like award season to get people energized and excited. But I think in terms of like when we're talking to a brand and a client, it doesn't really matter as much, actually.
Interesting. So what do they care about? Alignment?
Yeah, I think that they care about the alignment with the brand, with the style. And I think also what's come up even more than awards would be literally to look at, when applicable, is talent social and see how they're really presenting themselves in a genuine, organic way by themselves. Because I think that everyone knows at this point that when someone does a post, they can see through it. So I think that what's most important is to feel that the talent has genuine alignment with the brand, whether it's a magazine or an ad.
And not to make you work for free, but who should we be looking at? Who are you most excited about today?
That is a tricky question. That is a tricky question. Who am I most excited about today? Who am I championing? Can I skip that question?
Yeah, something that general probably lacks the variables or the context that typically get your gears going, right? Because you're always thinking through the lens of what fits within a particular world or particular brand. And so to be that general is probably quite challenging.
Yeah, because everything's really out there at this point. Like, I'm a psychiatrist to some of these people. I am a cultural anthropologist to some of these things where I don't even know if it's about going to the film festival and discovering that movie star, because the truth is that discovery is getting harder and harder because everything's out there. And as soon as like the movie hits, it's not just so isolated in that bubble. I think, people are reading about it before. So I think it's sort of like more about discerning and curating the information rather than discovering the person, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, it makes perfect sense. I think curation has become the sort of primary component in anyone's value proposition in the media because with so much noise, that's essentially what people are looking for and buying into is perspective, alignment, curation, and then, of course, elements of discoverability. But I think that goes back to what you were saying about timing being the most important because it's not necessarily doing something with an unknown person as much as it is about the sort of intersection of synergistic timing with that person and that brand and that idea that kind of contextually makes more sense or feels exciting, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think that the good examples when we did Devin Aoki for Acne, where Devin is such a beloved figure in the culture. And it was just exactly the time where I happened to see all of these online, and maybe that's what kind of put her there. But it was all these like accounts doing like all of her style references from her movies. And, there's certain people that just continually hit the zeitgeist and you never know when they're going to come back. Because to me, I've always loved her and I always thought she was amazing. But I don't know that that campaign, which I think it had a tremendous impact. And I think it was such a beautiful project to work on. Had it come out 5 years ago, I don't know that it would have hit the same way.
It wouldn't have. I mean, I think it's fair to say it wouldn't have.
There really was something in the culture at that moment that was like this person, again, not to be, not like my woo woo self, but I think I said in the New York Times that I had a little bit of a crystal ball. And I have to feel like that is what, what's guided me all this time and trusting your instincts a lot. And I think when that idea came up, I'm like, yes, this is an amazing idea, whether or not we can make it happen, because this person hadn't been working in a bit. And that's always the hard thing. But we always tell clients, let's try.
I mean, why wouldn't you? You have to. Otherwise, it all sort of falls flat real quick. Well, we can't finish this conversation without asking Greg K, the boy with the crystal ball, what is contemporary now?
What is contemporary now? I knew you were going to ask this, so I don't know why I'm still being stumped on this question. But I think in this moment where everyone's always online and plugged into the culture, I think what feels contemporary now to me is kind of taking that moment just to breathe and just really getting a sense of what feels right at this very moment in time. Because I think that in order to continue feeling relevant, you can't chase that. And you kind of have to just really take that moment for yourself. I think whenever we're doing these castings, whenever we're doing this, I kind of apply it to my life too, is just not get lost.
That's a pretty epic statement. And I don't want to ruin it by asking another question, but I can't help but ask, how do you avoid getting lost?
I think that like I've always had a lot of friends in the industry, but I think that truly the most important thing when I grew up, I always had a lot of different groups of friends. I never was one to settle on one clique. And I think just having the diversity of experiences that I have and kind of taking the time, I'll go to Paris for 10 days, but then I won't do anything in fashion for another 2 months. So I think I need that sort of constant unplugging and plugging to kind of go back and forth into that world. But I think what truly energizes me, which I guess is, again, I was saying without going too woo crystal ball, is the idea of having a life outside of it too.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again, Greg. I'm glad that we got to have you on.
Thank you for doing this. It was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our show's producer, Cheyenne Asadi, who makes it all possible. Audio post-production by Griffin James, with original theme music by Joseph Top Miller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft, and visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes every week, and if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn for additional content, and join the conversation around what is contemporary now.